Hey, Red Clay Rambler fans, this month we're celebrating 11 years of the podcast. I just launched a fund drive and I need your help to support this upcoming season. If you're able, please donate at talesofredclayrambler.com or you can become a sustaining member at patreon.com/redclayrambler. Until May the 31st, when you make your pledge on Patreon, you'll automatically receive a free Red Clay Rambler t-shirt along with your other perks. As always, thanks for listening, and let's get on with the show.
Hello, I'm Jeff, Executive Vice President here at Amoco Brent. Over 100 years ago, my grandfather founded Amoco. Today, my brother and I carry on his legacy. Our team works diligently to bring you the best clays, glazes, equipment, and more for your studio and classroom. This week's episode is brought to you by Amoco Brent. Please find your favorite Amoco or Brent product at your local distributor today. Thank you for choosing Amoco for all your clay and glaze needs.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 466 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Anat Shiftan. Her sculptures incorporate floral elements that are precariously arranged to highlight human influence on the cycles of nature. In our interview, we talk about her childhood and family history, as well as historic depictions of nature like Dutch still lifes, and her experience as an educator, which is coming to an end after 20 years at SUNY New Paltz. To see examples of her work, you can visit her website. That's anatshiftan.info. So without further ado, we'll get to the interview. First, I just wanted to talk about actually your history with art before ceramics. So can you talk about growing up in Jerusalem and seeing art, living with art, and having that be around you?
My first memory of seeing art is when I was a very young child, maybe 4 or 5 years old, and it was Velasquez's postcard that my dad had on a bookshelf of women in waiting, where I was very excited about the image and the privilege of the young princess. But in hindsight, I thought that picture was very informative in terms of defining the essence of art, which is about capturing the way we are in this world, and that the sense of being alive comes from seeing and being seen. I also had a lot of art in my life because my parents liked art, their friends liked art. They were not wealthy, but they had reproductions of Vermeer or little miniature paintings from Iran. My father was a big traveler in his work, so he would bring little things. And as a child, I was identified by the teachers and the parents as the artist in the family. So I had that happening. So I do remember specific art projects from kindergarten. I remember making a clay kitchen set, miniature kitchen set from terracotta. And I remember painting on a pillowcase. That was the closest they could provide us with oil painting experience. I remember the image I did, making sandals out of paper. I do remember a lot of things about art. And then I would say that another formative moment was in third grade. So third and fourth grade. So I have this memory in third grade when I did live for 2 years in New York City, being taken to the Metropolitan. And that was, like a waterfall of an experience, like standing under the Niagara Falls. And the person who took me there bought me a reproduction of Van Gogh's Sunflowers. I had that forever in my childhood room. They were building next to my neighborhood the Israel Museum, and I took art classes there. And I remember very well the projects that we did there, standing and doing a pencil drawing of a sculpture of our choice, or all kinds of projects. So it was there.
Did you end up going back to Jerusalem, or did you stay in the States?
I was in the States for 2 years, but we went back to Jerusalem for the rest of my upbringing. And I only came to the States when I was 28, I think, something like that.
Do you mind if I ask you questions about your family history?
No.
I'm interested in how this notion of immigration plays into your self-identity. So can you talk about how your family came to Israel and the circumstances of that?
Right. So my parents were born in Germany, and my mother was born in the west side of Germany, very close to Frankfurt, in a small town called Mainz. And she grew up seeing the Nazi regime take roots in the society and had a very tough childhood. Her brother was a Zionist and moved to Israel in 1936. And he was able to bring his mom and my mom in 1937. So while my mother experienced the humiliation of being deprived of education and rights and being labeled a Jew, she didn't really go through any wartime kind of experience. And my father grew up in Erfurt, which was in East Germany eventually. I don't know which town it's next to. I think it's kind of it's next to, it will come to me in a minute. And he was in rabbinical school at the time of 1939 when Kristallnacht happened. And he was arrested and sent to Buchenwald and was laboring there. And it so happened that his aunts moved to Israel in 1932 because they were very liberal and they were very independent women, and they just decided they're not going to take this. So from Buchenwald, they were able to enroll him in the Hebrew University in Israel, and that gave him the visa to go to Israel. And it was very interesting. Very few people were able to get out of the concentration camp. It wasn't war yet, but it was a time when people were being killed in the concentration camps and doing hard labor. And he was able to get out, as well as his best friend. So that is kind of the story I like to tell for this story also, because you were talking more about identity and how the story of immigration feels. And of course, this story of immigration feels, as for many other people in the world in different political strife, a story of escape. So my grandmother in 1936 did take my father to Israel, and they moved there. And when things got so horrible, she went back because she was the social worker of her community, and she went back to help. And so she took my dad back with her. So she ended up in Auschwitz while he was able to then go back to Israel again. So she actually moved back to Germany to help her community. She arranged a lot of children to go to England with kid transport and things like that. But as far as how it influenced me as I'm growing, you probably know that in Israel there was kind of like two groups: the groups that grew up with the Holocaust experience, and there's this famous story where it's David Grossman. He wrote this novel where he said, "When I woke up, my grandfather always slapped my face, so I knew life is not so great." And the other families where nothing was talked about so that life will be perceived as great. And so that was my family. So I only discovered my parents' stories at a later time in my life. But I do feel that there was a thread of sadness, a thread of secrecy, a thread of loss, and a thread of strangeness, because all the adults spoke German, but they wouldn't speak German to us. You know, they would speak to themselves in their language, but then turn around and speak to us in Hebrew. That kind of sense of loss, I think, is very much in my body.
Yeah, and I always think with immigration, the circumstances of immigration obviously determine later generations. And with this idea of escape, like that your father needed to leave. I mean, he was in an actual concentration camp. So this was like, it seems like that from generation to generation, how we define ourselves is based on what has happened to us. And so one of the things you said in a talk that you gave is that you turn to nature because you need to, like that your depictions of nature are a respite from actual history in your life and in your family, which was pretty dark. Can you talk about nature as a solution in a way, or as a high point, a sense of hope?
Right. So actually not, because nature has the same cycles that happen in human history.
Good point.
And we have a warped idea about nature, that it's balanced and harmonic, and we forget that nature is really mirroring the same kind of competition for survival that includes aggression and repression. You know, the poison ivy sucks the juice out of the trees. Invasive plants, there's the same kind of that kind of ambivalence. I'm kind of interested in it because it's really mirroring the human condition. It's no different. And it's kind of cyclical to think that humanity is not so good, so look at nature. But let's look at nature, it's reflecting humanity. Well, maybe the world, the way we're taught to think that it can be good, is unnatural. That it's not that I'm promoting negative consequences for any human behavior, but we are taught to think that it's unnatural. And maybe in some horrible way, it's horrible, but it is natural. So maybe the natural is not positive. And we learn to think that natural is positive and that evil is not. So it's very confusing, but very interesting. And of course, the good and the bad are really tightly tied together. So we really experience it constantly together. And it's very confusing because as rational beings, we want it to be either or. It's very hard for us to be bad and good together, positive and negative together, growth and death together. But that is how it is. So when I was saying I'm escaping looking at humanity, it's because it's a little harder. But in nature, I see the same. And then, it brings you to the subject of beauty. Humanity is beautiful and nature is beautiful. But there's also some few things that are not so beautiful. The difference is that not everybody agrees, but to an extent, we think that nature has less consciousness. So we have less blame and judgment to the processes of decay and control and exploitation, whereas humans are attributed ethical judgment, and so we expect them not to do that.
Yeah, and just the idea that there's power that comes from ambivalence, that like looking at something that is both positive, negative, that then as an artist gives you the leeway to really incorporate a wide amount of things. And some of your influences that in this talk I was listening to, you talked about Dutch still lives as being a big influence. And you said, like there's the beautiful flowers, but there's always an element of decay, like whether that's petals that have fallen off or there was I think a fly was in that particular painting.
Right.
And that's so interesting, this idea of trying to depict and capture that life-death cycle. So can you talk about your love of those still lives, but then also how you've interpreted that in your own work?
So first of all, we know the still life a lot of times is really beautiful and seductive, which is kind of the essence of art. So good art often, not always, seems at first sight very beautiful and seductive. And when you kind of go in, you begin to see elements of disharmony, elements of disappointment. So the still life is sort of like that. So even if, of course, there is a still life that is showing you elements of decay and corruption and maybe portraying negative attributes in human character, like lust, or the physicality, which in the sexuality, which is considered in some cultures and sometimes a problem rather than an asset. But even when the still life does not have this direct reference to the seven deadly sins, the fact that it's artificially organized, that it's in essence resembling our idea of what harmony is, what balance is, what beauty is, when those still lives don't have those direct references, yet it's totally artificial, kind of creates that conundrum about if beauty is really in nature or just like our desire for perfection that's not really there. And so it comes also to very absurd kind of moments within the history of the floral still life, where you have all these flowers that never bloom together in one flower pot.
And I think you're right that artists were about creating the unreal in a realistic way, so like the idea that these flowers would never bloom at the same time and therefore they wouldn't be in a vase at the same time is so interesting, because if you ask an 18-year-old art student now, does that still life represent reality, they would probably say yes.
And that brings to another thing that I like to think about is where our knowledge comes from. Because unlike Adam and Eve, our knowledge comes from previously processed knowledge. So it's very unobjective. I talk about it a little bit when I talk about, if I want to make artwork about a hair, would I look at Durer's image or would I look at a hair in nature? Do I even have a hair available for me to look at? So that is kind of a different kind of remoteness from what the natural is, not available to us. As it's interesting that the idea of nature is not a realistic thing. It's an ideal that we have in our head about how things have been, should be, but maybe never have. Therefore, the lost garden of paradise, right? I just wanted to say also with the still life, it's kind of a painterly language with conventions. When you start looking, you see that there's a whole genre of still life paintings that have the peeled lemon, that have the broken pomegranate. And also the still life has in it sort of a recording of embarrassment of the riches, because it's all about things being plentiful. A lot of those still lifes will have a platter from China and fruit from Mediterranean countries where citrus grows. And so it must have been really expensive to get a whole bunch of lemons in the Netherlands at the time. So it kind of really, even if the lemon is not peeled and even if the pomegranate is not broken, it already encases in it some sense of privilege. And I think that maybe privilege is always looked in some places as earned, but in some places as earned incorrectly.
Yeah, and in the history of ceramics is so embedded, or at least what we think of the history of the trade of ceramics is so embedded in those still lifes. Because you've got like the European gaze, I mean, that's the painter painting. But then you have export ware made in China that's been traded through the Silk Road in different forms to get there. So you have they are really interesting cultural sort of snapshots, and I think you even said that in your talk is that these paintings really are capturing a moment, but even more than that, they're capturing a global perspective in a moment.
Yeah.
How are you interested in that now, like in terms of the way you're interpreting that into your sculptural work?
Yeah, I think I'm at a crossroad where I have to recenter and think about that further. But I wanted to share with you the first time I kind of had this recollection. So there was a show at the Metropolitan, and it was called Beyond Babylon. And there was an object there, and the little card next to it said that it was some kind of a box, a small box, and the back of it was made out of ivory, and the top of it was made out of wood. It was kind of some kind of a duck or a goose, and it said that there is no way that this was not reassembled, was not a reassembled object from two different cultures, Egypt and Mesopotamian location. I don't know. So it really fascinated me to think about how, and that was kind of like in the 80s when people were talking about the global village and how the world is shrinking. And it really fascinated me to think that the world was always in communication and that the world was always learning from each other. About it right now, I kind of find it interesting, and it maybe take us a little bit to conversing about education, but maybe that's not your idea. That in some moments, maybe in your creative process, you need very strong anchors that are theoretical. And then in other moments, you can allow yourself to let loose a little bit of those anchors and kind of see where your path of making takes you. And I kind of talk to students about it a lot because we ask them to anchor their work in theory and readings. And then there's this kind of disparity between the object and the research. And how does that come together? What does it mean? But I'm thankful that you asked that question because I would love to think about it now again and see where it takes me. I think one of the things that I'm thinking about is that throughout my years of doing work, I was identifying myself as a Western artist and not necessarily taking too much attention my Jewish identity or my Middle Eastern upbringing, my Israeli upbringing, and my connection to those cultures. I think it's also an avoidance strategy, but I'm definitely wanting to put space in my life for that research, for that idea.
I think one of the areas, and this is kind of off on a tangent, but related, is that I've been thinking about the way your work is structurally organized relative to the Armenian pots that you were showing in that slide talk. So, and people actually will probably know the Iznik versions of a lot of those patterns. They're very, like in my mind, I was thinking those are Iznik pots, and you were talking about it. Actually, they're Armenian, and the difference is that am I right in thinking the Armenians were Christian, the Iznik potters were Islamic, but they were working within a cultural milieu. I mean, it was a style of work that was being created in that time. Is that right?
I'm going to look into it. I'm not sure, Ben, but let's get back to it. I do have a book that I just brought home from school about the Armenian potters. The Armenian potters are Christian, and they did come to Israel to renovate the Temple Mosque, the blue one, the big one. And so that's how they settled in Jerusalem, because they were brought. If you look at the tile, it's in perfect condition. It's only a few hundred years old. It's not from the 600s. So that's what they're doing there. The relationship between the Armenian and the Iznik people, I haven't looked into, but great question. But I do love Iznik pottery.
Oh man, that's my favorite.
Really? Mm-hmm.
But the way I'm thinking about it actually is though the structure of those pots is that the decoration, they're patterns, but they have a very specific repetitious element. Even if you're not seeing all of the elements that repeat, you can tell it's within a larger context. And in your work, there's times in which the organization of the way you make things is more piles, like it's almost like the floral elements are stacked on top of each other. And then there's other times where you're making tiles where it's more like a repeated pattern that's like flower, 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 that's almost lined up in a grid. So can you talk about how, once you realize you're going to work within a floral scheme, how do you determine, like, is it going to be more asymmetric and almost like accumulation being the idea of the structure versus a linear logical pattern? How do you figure that out as a maker?
In the Flora series and the Forest series, those are piles. And they're kind of about nature being something that is beginning of a life, but also collapse of a life, which is kind of the idea of the pile. But when I render 2D flowers, which I think is what you're talking about, it kind of comes more like from a research moment, a little bit from where do I see nature? I see it in books. I see it in the decorative arts. I don't take a flower and look at it. I look at how other people rendered flowers. And so then it's more of a contemplative sort of process. It has a little bit less of that commentary and more a celebration of the decorative traditions, acknowledging that the decorative is not neutral content-wise. I consider it more of a Zen process. Like, I look at a book and I try to render and interpret it, to interpret the floral. Because I think one of the reasons that these flowers have been always rendered is that it was either a spiritual source or a sustenance source. So it's kind of like food for life to look at those magical things that are both positive, negative. It's not exactly connected. Like, I consider it a different body of work almost.
Well, that's what I'm interested in. Is I know, as someone who also works with flowers, is that it is very hard to change the structure of the way you do something, because it's a whole different mindset. So when I look at the sculptures that you make that are piles of things, my brain is trying to figure out, like, how did she get to that? Like there's enough chaos in it that it keeps my eye very engaged with it. And also, they're 3D sculptures, so I want to move around them and consume them in that way, as to where the other work that's more like a repetitious pattern or drawing from a pattern, my brain gets it faster. But it doesn't, one is not better than the other. I'm just impressed that as an artist, you can switch between the two because they're very different ways of organizing something.
Right. Are you talking about the small piece of turf, the white flowers that are up like that?
Yeah.
So in that case, it's not so successful. I should go back to it again, but I just really love this idea that Durer crawled on the floor, on the ground, and did a drawing from as if he's laying on the ground of just a bunch of weeds. I was just thinking about it the other day that I use the same flower again and again, and I should really do a more complex thing that has that kind of vision. And I do love weeds. I always say going on the highway is my favorite thing because there's so many weeds in between the two lanes, and I'm never bored. Understanding weeds as something radical is kind of interesting because you want to, if you are an important painting, you draw an important flower, but aren't all flowers important, and aren't weeds how we got into having wheat? So it's kind of interesting cycles of hierarchies. I like to think about hierarchies.
Yeah, talk more about that.
Well, first of all, I have my own prejudice about plants. So I think that forsythia is a low on the food chain plant. So from that perspective. And then I think that as rational beings, we want to divide the world into categories, and that gives us a better understand the illusion of better understanding the world. But I don't think the world is organized that way. It's just that we need systems of understanding. Our brain needs categorization and division and ladder of importance. But that is in order to facilitate how we understand things, not how things necessarily are.
You're hitting on something that's kind of a philosophical point of my whole spiritual practice, which is that the illusion of control is usually what we give ourselves to feel safe, but it's an illusion. And I display that by comparing gardening, where plants are grown where you want them to grow, as a way of human control. Like we're trying to line things up to make them beautiful. But also when you're hiking through the forest and you find flowers that have naturally grown there with no human contact, to me, that's actually the most beautiful, because there is not an element of control beyond maybe a bird ate some seeds and happened to be flying, and that's how they got there. There's something that's both random but also real and beautiful in that situation that I think is more beautiful than gardening.
It makes me think about gardening because I understand that you love gardening too. And I find gardening the easiest activity in the world. A lot of times I'll be reading a book and all of a sudden I'll find myself outside. What's going on? And I would like to think more about the relationships of things we said about nature, humanity, and the relationships and the logic of it, and how gardening fits in. So, for example, in my house, in my little area, in my garden, there's an area that's more like an English garden where everything grows. I still cultivate it, right? I still pull out the weeds and everything. So it's kind of interesting to think about that idea of gardening as a method of control, which is kind of negative, but yields something positive, maybe. It's ambivalent. I mean, I think concluding that things are ambivalent is very inspiring, because I think our idea that things need to be this way or that way are very inhibiting. I think accepting ambivalence, it's a harder way of being, but it's maybe a more true way of being, perhaps. I don't know, but I'm thinking about it. I know that I suffer personally from a lot of ambivalence that is sometimes stifling. Like, should I do this or should I do that? Am I good or bad? Did I do the right thing? Should I, all that kind of stuff. And do I like this or don't I like this? Should I? It's hard.
There's this great Buddhist scripture that I have read many times called the Sing Sing Ming. The English translation is that I think that's the faith mind, but it talks about that good and bad is a trap. And I think so much about that because I've been a meditator for a long time, and through meditation, if you get stuck in the analysis of good and bad, you can lose 5 years of your life that way.
Yeah.
That's also, I think, the mind's way to control something is to put it in a category. Like, is this good? Is this bad? So I know that it's helpful in some ways because ideally, if we can categorize things, we can then move on. But if you do get stuck in the middle, like you're saying, did I make the right decision? Did I make the wrong decision? That also is like, it's such a hard thing to move on. And it's also, as an artist, something we do all the time. Like we make little micro decisions in the studio on and on and on and on. So I wanted to actually bring in your understanding of color into this discussion. You often will work in forms that are repeated, but then there'll be a different color. So I'm thinking about the large still lives that are on the table that are like multiple feet long with multiple objects. I've seen those in all white, I've seen those in all blue, and then I've seen them like as a mixture of those. But within that work, the color itself is the form. So it's not like you're decorating the vessel, the Greek vessel that you've made. The whole thing is that color. So can you talk about deciding color on a form and how you sort of think through that process?
With the original Still Life series, the ones that were small, with the Greek amphora, that series, I wanted it to be white because I wanted it to be as close as possible to a thought, even though it had a physical presence. So in a way, white is not as concrete as yellow or green or blue. And in a way, white is, other than transparent, is the closest possible to none there, which is also why the surface absorbs a lot of the light. It's not a reflective surface. So if it's not interacting with space, it's less of an object, if an object can be less of an object. With the blue, the blue version of this series, where there's blue or blue and white, I was bringing the blue because of its connection to cobalt and the history of cobalt. And in those still lifes, I try to capture the history of ceramics. The white and blue is kind of reference. But I want to say that I put the color in the clay, so it's not applied. So it's blue clay, which is kind of different, because I really like to think about color as an essence, not as an afterthought or a coating. And I struggle with that when I glaze, how much of it looks like a shell over the clay and how much of it looks like the essence of the object. So I will say that adding stain to the clay body makes it less plastic. So it's not always very useful to make large objects from colored clay. So I do use glazes. I try to use glazes that absorb the light, so it looks less like coating and shrink wrap and more like it's part of the clay body. So with the yellows, it was an exercise in getting inspired by nature. And, I do love how daffodils die and keep their color. And I was kind of getting from there into exploring different versions of yellow and green. But I'll also say that yellow is that color that I first experienced as an essence as a child versus as a coating. And I talked about it in that talk. So in Israel, the daisy in the spring is all over the place, and it's a real strong, perfect sunflower yellow. And you can bring the whole flower is yellow of the same hue, and you can bring it to your eye, and you're immersed in yellow, and the structure fades away, and the color becomes the topic that you experience. And I find it very magical, so I wanted to repeat it. So I did it with the blue and the yellow. And then it kind of got maybe a little decorative more, and I started other surfaces. Maybe I should be tighter again. Well, it kind of relates to what I told you before, that, as an artist, you have to have reasons to do what you do, but maybe when you're in a path, you allow yourself some explorations that are more intuitive rather than rational and learned.
Let's switch gears and talk about your teaching career. Part of this is that you've been able to have time, I would imagine, or this is a question. How does being a teacher then give you time to do this research? Because it feels like your life is compartmentalized in a way. There's teaching time and then there's research time.
And also, Ben, just for the sake of all the women who might listen to this, I was also a single mom to 2 children.
Okay, gotcha.
So it's really hard. You have to be a really hard worker. And even if you feel that you're not focused, in the long run, when you see the outcome, you realize that you were focused. But you do get pulled in a lot of different directions. But what I will say that was really wonderful, which is why it's so hard for me to retire, is that working with students was such an inspiration. And exploring technical things with students was so informative to me. And I definitely realized that where I got to with my work is totally related to my school activity. So I don't see it as a part. And now I'm thinking, how do I compensate? So For example, with a theory, reading is very inspiring. And even when reading is not directly related to what you're doing, it's energizing because your brain is working. You get that adrenaline of like, it's happy. So I'm thinking of how to create a forum of people that are in my life stage that want to do a reading group so that that excitement continues, because it's one thing to read for yourself, but it's also really fun to read with people and share ideas. And so I love, for example, teaching seminar and learning about the history of crafts and the history of making and how our histories are relevant to the field of ceramics. How can we apply these considerations, these conundrums to what we are doing? How what we make, which is object, can have some kind of social impact or meaning or personal meaning, all that kind of stuff. So the answer is it comes together if you're engaged with what you do. And maybe the answer is engagement. I did see recently this artist, her name is, I'll tell you later who it is. I can't remember. She's Swedish. And she said that when she's in the studio, she feels she should be home. And when she's at home, she feels she should be in the studio. And there is a little bit of that, both with school and the studio and with family life in the studio and friendships in the studio. Balancing in our times is a really hard one. But I think in hindsight, if one can appreciate that in time, the fruit crystallizes, then you can feel good that even though you're divided, it comes together, but it just takes time. But I feel that school really informed my thinking in my own studio and vice versa. For example, I love giving my basic students, once we learned all our techniques, a self-portrait still life project and see what happens.
Can you describe New Paltz for people in that general, the school and the area, what it was like when you came, and then how that's, because you've been there a long time. So how has that changed over time?
So New Paltz is located 80 miles north of Manhattan, and it's at the foot of the Catskills. Mohonk Mountains is our area. And it's very beautiful. It's in the Hudson Valley, and it's very relatively not controlled by the corporate world. So you have a lot of rural landscape, but not large farms. And you don't have a lot of, McDonald's, strip malls, that kind of thing. So it's very, very beautiful. There's a lot of hiking. There's beautiful nature. It's great. A lot of farm to table culture. In the last 10 years, our area became really popular because New York became impossible financially. So there's a huge migration of people like us to this area. Historically, really interesting. So Long Island was for painting and Northern New York was for sculptors. So there's a lot of very famous sculptors who lived in the area. But now makers are coming. And so it's becoming a huge makers community, which is great. Really fun. And as far as New Paltz goes, it's a small town. It's very cute. It's a college town, and the campus is a state university campus. So it's quite nice, but not ostentatious. The school is very affordable. So it's not your audience of silver spoon fed children. It's very hard to get into the school, but hardworking people. So that's really nice. And we have a really good art school. It's very large. We have really good facilities. So that's kind of like the general. We have an MFA program and a BFA program. We have a 4,000 square feet facility that is flexible. So we allow ourselves to change our agenda and the interior architecture depending on what we want to achieve. It's a liberal arts school, so we serve the whole school for foundation courses and general education courses. Then we have a degree in visual arts, a BFA in ceramics, and then an MFA program in ceramics. And so then specifically, if we go to our studio, it's divided to two wings. There's a wing where all the BFA and undergrad activity happens, and a wing where the grads have their space. And in between are the functional facilities. So it's the glaze room, the kiln room, the et cetera, where we mix clay. And our students maintain the function of the studio together. So the grads and the undergrads are very close because they share facility and they share the space where they actually get the work going. So it's a really neat environment. It's a very beautiful space and collaborative kind of warm space.
When we spoke briefly at NCCA, you said that you're heading towards retirement. So how do you feel about that? Like, how are you feeling looking forward to a new stage in life?
Yes. So that's where we talk about ambivalence, right? As we talked before. I love my work. And in a way, I'm not ready to leave. But I also recognize that I'm 68. And I'm curious about life after work. So one of the things that I'm curious about is when I went to art school, I wanted to be an artist mostly. And eventually I wanted to be a teacher, and it turned out really a good fit. But it would be interesting to be a full-time artist. But I am right now, I'm not so happy. I'm lamenting having to say goodbye to all this because it's been great. It's been wonderful. So I'm not happy about it, but I'm doing it, but I'm not happy about it. Yeah. And we have right now such a good time at school. I have a great colleague, Brian Cibez. It's amazing to work with Brian. And why would I leave it? Oh, because I'm 68.
And when is your last year teaching?
This.
Oh, wow. So you're going to retire in like a month.
Yes.
Wow. Congrats.
Thank you.
I know it can be bittersweet, but I've seen so many artists. I always think of Ron Myers, who after he retired from the University of Georgia, he could devote himself to work in a very different way. And it's not that you can't tell his work is still his work, but all of a sudden he could make so much of it. And I'm such a fan of his work. So I'm sure it's going to end up being really good when you can just focus on the studio.
Yeah, it will be interesting because I've always been productive. Like, work is where I feel comfortable. I love working. So I'm not worried that I won't work. Maybe I'll work in a way that's a little more calculated and less intuitive and in frenzy. Because, when you teach, you say, okay, I have 3 months now to do this body of work for this show. And it's crazy. But I have heard also about Beth Lowe, who really thrived when she retired. So I'm looking forwards to that. But, the students are wonderful. There's a lot in our field. Teaching is much more than teaching. There's a lot of love and connection and continued relationships. And to forgo it is really hard. But I will say that yesterday, Brian showed me the list of all our alums, and I was floored to realize how many people have gone through. And a few years ago, I did the math of how many basic students I've had in the years, and it was something like 800.
Oh, wow.
Because if you think that you teach, or 600, I can't remember the number. If you teach every year 30 students basic times 600 times 20 years, that's 600. That's a lot of basic students.
It is.
Yeah. Although basic, is sometimes I thought, why am I still teaching basic? But I love igniting the spark for people who it's for them. It's a great gift to be able to allow people to discover that they love clay, and that is what they should do in their life. Because we know that it's a beautiful life. Maybe our paycheck is not $500,000 every month, but our reward is amazing. It's really good.
Well, to wrap up, can you leave your social media or website so people could get in touch if they want to?
Yeah, I would love that. So it's Anat Shiftan is on Instagram, just my name. And for my website, it's anatshiftan.info.
And remind me the name of your gallery.
Hustler Burroughs. And they're located, they have 3 locations. They have a gallery in the West Village on 10th Street. They have a gallery in Tribeca, where they started, actually. And they have a gallery on Melrose in LA. They're very, very nice people.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate you doing this.
Thank you, Ben. It's been awesome. Yeah, I really love talking to you.
I'd like to thank Anat for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to hear more about her life and work, and I'm still thinking about some of the things she said in this interview. If you would like to be a supporter on the show, we are in the midst of our spring fund drive. If you make a donation on Patreon before May the 31st, you'll automatically receive a free t-shirt along with your other perks. You can find out more at patreon.com/redclayrambler. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's Amico Brent, the Archie Bray Foundation, and the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch through our network website. That's brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.